humanity entered the Galactic Council, and the aliens finally understood fear. The seat was still warm from the last species that had died in it. No one said that out loud, of course. The Galactic Council had manners. They had centuries of practiced diplomacy, layered protocols, and a deeply refined talent for pretending uncomfortable truths did not exist. But I knew it. Every person on my team knew it. The Valkyrie had gone extinct 14 months ago, a slow collapse, a dying sun, a civilization that ran out of time, and their empty seat had been sitting in chamber 1 of Evum Prime like an open wound ever since. Earth was not invited to fill it because we were impressive. We were invited because we were available. I am Commander Yale Dross. I have spent 22 years in the Earth Diplomatic Corps, the last 6 of which were dedicated entirely to monitoring Galactic Council transmissions that we were never meant to intercept. I know these aliens. I have studied their body language, their negotiating patterns, their quiet arrogance, and their long, settled belief that humanity was a loud, chaotic footnote in a galaxy that had already sorted itself out. They were not prepared for me to walk through that door and look comfortable. The UES Endurance broke orbit around Evum Prime at 600-hour station time. I was standing at the observation deck when the station came into full view, and I will admit, it was something. Evum Prime is roughly the size of a small moon, a construct so old that 3 of its original builders no longer exist as species. It hangs in the dark between 2 dead stars, lit from within, its surface covered in architecture that belongs to at least 40 different civilizations, each generation of builders adding their layer on top of the last. It looks like what would happen if you asked 1,000 different artists to each paint one corner of the same canvas, and somehow it all held together. My aide, Lieutenant Paul Greer, stood beside me. He was 26, the youngest member of my team, and the only one who had never been off-planet before this mission. He had spent the last 3 weeks memorizing every piece of council protocol ever recorded. "It's bigger than I expected," he said quietly. "It always is," I told him, even though I had never been here either. I said it because it was the kind of thing that needed to be said. We needed to walk onto that station like we had walked into rooms like this before, like we belonged. Because we did belong. That was the part the council had not fully accepted yet. The docking process took 40 minutes. Every step of it was designed, I realized, to be slightly inconvenient for a new arrival, forms submitted in triplicate across 3 different council languages, none of which were English, biometric scans that required standing still for 11 minutes inside a chamber that was 12 degrees colder than comfortable, and a greeting committee that showed up 8 minutes late without apology. I filled out every form correctly. I stood still for the full 11 minutes. When the greeting committee finally arrived, I smiled at them. The lead greeter was a Savari, tall, narrow-shouldered, with 4 pale eyes arranged in a slight arc across a flat face. His name, roughly translated, was Senior Delegate Coordinator Orvith. He was the kind of official who had spent so long welcoming newcomers that the welcome had become entirely mechanical. He looked at me, looked at my team of 12, and I watched something flicker in those 4 eyes. Something that was not quite surprise but was very close to it. "Commander Dross," he said in careful, accented English, a small courtesy that I noted. "Welcome to Evum Prime. On behalf of the Galactic Council, we extend formal acknowledgement of humanity's provisional membership." Provisional. That word sat in the air like a stone dropped into still water. "Thank you, Coordinator Orvith," I said. "On behalf of Earth and the 11 colonies, we are glad to be here." I did not say we were honored. I did not say we were grateful. I said we were glad, which is a different thing entirely. Glad is what you say when something has gone the way you expected it to go. He processed that for just a moment too long. Then he turned and led us through the corridor. Evum Prime's interior is overwhelming in the best possible way. The central concourse alone is 3 kilometers long and open to a ceiling so high it has its own microweather. I saw what looked like a small cloud forming near the upper arch as we walked beneath it. Species from across the galaxy moved around us, each one different, each one dressed in the colors and symbols of their civilization. Some of them barely glanced at us. Others stopped completely and stared. Paul walked beside me, taking it all in. I could see him working very hard to keep his expression neutral, which meant he was actually doing a reasonable job of it. "Do not look like a tourist," I said under my breath. "I'm not looking like a tourist," he said. "You looked at that cloud for 4 full seconds." He faced forward immediately. The chamber assigned to the human delegation was on the 72nd floor, with a view of the station's inner ring. It was adequate, not generous, not insulting, just adequate, which told me exactly where we stood in the council's estimation. The Murath Collective's chambers, which I had studied in the station's public layout files, were on the 91st floor. The HFY occupied floors 100 through 112. We were on 72, noted. I called the team together before any of them unpacked. 12 people, diplomats, analysts, 2 doctors, a cultural liaison, and Paul. All of them had been selected not just for their qualifications, but for a specific quality I had looked for in every interview. The ability to remain calm when the world they expected turned out to be slightly different from the world in front of them. "This is what we know," I said, standing at the center of the room. "The council offered us this seat because it was empty and we were the fastest option. They expect us to be overwhelmed. They expect us to spend our first several months asking questions and learning how things work before we have the courage to say anything of consequence. They have given us a provisional membership, which means they reserve the right to revisit the decision if we cause disruption." I let that sit for a moment. "Here is what we are going to do instead. We are going to learn this station faster than they expect. We are going to attend every session, read every document, and understand every current dispute on the council floor. We are going to be polite, we are going to be professional, and we are going to be ready. When our moment comes, and it will come, we will not hesitate." No one asked what the moment would look like. They trusted that I would know it when I saw it. That evening, I sat by the window alone and looked out at the inner ring of Evam Prime. Ships from a dozen different civilizations moved slowly through the docking lanes. Lights from 1,000 different chambers reflected off the dark plating of the station's walls. Somewhere down those corridors, delegates from 47 species were having conversations that had been happening in various forms for centuries. And now, for the first time in any of those centuries, a human was watching. I had read every piece of research humanity had on the Galactic Council. I had read their public treaties, their ceremonial records, their joint statements. I had also read the things they never meant for us to see, the intercepted signals, the background assessments, the quiet internal reports that described humanity in the kind of language usually reserved for geological hazards and unpredictable weather systems. They found us strange. Not dangerous, not yet just strange. We had too many emotions that we showed too openly. We made decisions too quickly. We formed loyalties that made no logical sense, and then held on to them with a persistence that the council's analysts kept flagging as statistically unusual. We had survived things that should have ended us, repeatedly, without any outside help, and our response to each near ending had been to build something larger than what we had before. One internal report, dated 6 years prior, had described humanity as a species that has not yet learned to accept its own limitations. I thought about that report a lot. I thought about it as a criticism first. Then I thought about it again and realized it was actually just a fact, stated without the understanding of what it meant. We had never learned to accept our limitations because, historically, whenever we reached one, we moved it. The next morning, I dressed in my formal uniform, dark blue, clean lines. The Earth flag on the left shoulder and the diplomatic corps insignia on the right. And I walked into the first full council session with my team behind me. The chamber was enormous. 47 delegation platforms arranged in a wide arc, each one elevated at the same height, each one facing the central floor where speakers stood to address the full body. Above everything, a glass ceiling looked out into open space. Every eye in that chamber, and some of those species had a great many eyes, turned toward us as we entered and took our places on Platform 48. I sat down, folded my hands on the table in front of me, and looked out at the full assembled Galactic Council. They looked back. I smiled, not a large smile, just enough to be visible. Coordinator Orvith, seated at the ceremonial center platform, cleared his throat and began the session. But I noticed, and I filed it away carefully, that it took him a breath longer than usual to start speaking. Good, they had already noticed something they had not planned for. We had not even said a word yet. The first rule of the Galactic Council, as written in the founding charter that was now almost 900 years old, was simple. All disputes between member civilizations must be resolved through deliberation, never through force. It sounded reasonable. It was reasonable for most of the species in that room. The HFY had not fought a war in 400 years. The Murath Collective had never fought one at all. They had evolved past individual conflict so thoroughly that the concept of organized military action was, to them, the kind of abstract horror that humans reserved for stories about things that could never actually happen. The Drachkin Compact had fought plenty, but they had learned, after losing badly twice in council-mediated disputes, that the rules favored patience over action, and they had become very, very patient. I spent the first 2 weeks saying almost nothing. I sat in every session. I read every document that the Council's archive system would release to a provisional member, and I had Paul quietly map the ones that were restricted, not to access them without permission, but to know what shape the silence had. Knowing what you are not being told is almost as useful as knowing what you are. By the end of the second week, I had a complete picture of the Council's current concerns. There were 4 major ongoing disputes. 2 of them were territorial, the kind of slow, procedural arguments about planetary resource boundaries that had been moving through Council review for decades and would continue moving through Council review for decades more. One was a trade disagreement between the HFY and a smaller species called the Fen, which had been filed 17 years ago and was currently on its 4th round of mediation. And one was something newer, something the Council was handling with the particular careful neutrality that told me it made them deeply uncomfortable. The Drachkin Compact had established what they were calling a security perimeter around a cluster of systems near the outer edge of mapped space. 3 of those systems contained human colonies. The official Drachkin position was that the perimeter was a defensive measure against what they vaguely described as unregistered activity in the region. They had filed the appropriate notifications with the Council. The Council had accepted the notifications and placed them under standard review. Standard review, in Council terms, meant a minimum of 18 months before any formal response was required. I read the file 3 times. Then I called Paul into my office, a small room off the main delegation chamber, and closed the door. "Tell me what you know about the Drachkin Compact," I said. Paul had done his homework. He always did. Expansionist history. They held 4 systems about 200 years ago and now hold 31. Most of that growth happened through what they call administrative integration of smaller civilizations. Basically, they move in, establish a presence, and make it easier to join them than to resist. They have never directly attacked a council member, but they have applied a lot of pressure to provisional members and non-members in the past. And the colonies inside their new perimeter. Kepler Station, New Harrow, and the farming settlement on Arctis 4. He paused. About 400,000 people total. 400,000 people, sitting inside a Drachkin security perimeter, with 18 months before the council was required to formally respond. "File the grievance," I said. Paul nodded and started to leave. "Paul." He stopped. "File it correctly. Every form, every supporting document, every procedural requirement. I want it to be the most properly filed grievance this council has ever received." He understood. He left without another word. I sat alone for a moment and then sent a single encrypted transmission back to Earth. It was short. It contained only one line of operational text and a specific authorization code that I had been given before departure, a code that had been sitting in a sealed document in my mission briefing, marked for use at my discretion. The code authorized Fleet Contingency 7. I did not tell anyone on my team what that meant. Not yet. What it meant was that 32 Earth vessels, currently on routine patrol assignments scattered across 4 different sectors, would begin quietly repositioning. They would do it slowly. They would use standard shipping lanes. They would file no special flight plans. And within approximately 14 days, they would be in a location that I found considerably more useful than where they currently were. The council session the following morning covered the Drachkin perimeter as a side item, not even a main agenda point, just a noted update. Senior Delegate Vora of the Drachkin Compact sat across the chamber from me. He was broad and low to the ground, with a dark, ridged exterior that his species had evolved over millennia in a high-pressure environment. He had been a council delegate for 30 years. He was very good at looking calm. He glanced at me once during the session. I looked back at him steadily. He looked away first. I stored that information. After the session, as the chamber was clearing, I was approached by a delegate I had not yet spoken to directly, Dr. Ashavin, the cultural liaison from the Murath Collective. She was one of the species that was difficult to read physically. The Murath communicated largely through color shifts in their upper membrane, which my translation equipment converted into approximate emotional tone. The converter told me she was registering curiosity with an undertone of concern. "Commander Dross," she said, "I hope the transition to station life is going well." "Very well, thank you," I said. She hesitated, which was unusual for someone who had spent decades in diplomacy. "I have been reviewing the translated archive of human history for academic purposes." "Of course." "I found it," she paused again, and the color shift in her membrane flickered briefly into something the converter labeled as difficulty finding the right word. "Eventful," she finished. "That is one way to describe it," I agreed. "Your species has experienced a remarkable number of civilization-level crises, and yet the population figures continue to grow after each one. The infrastructure recovers. The cultural output increases." She tilted her head slightly. "Our models suggest that a species experiencing your historical level of disruption should exhibit one of 2 outcomes. Either significant psychological passivity, a kind of learned helplessness, or extreme aggression as a permanent societal baseline. Your species exhibits neither." I looked at her carefully. "What does our species exhibit in your assessment?" She was quiet for a moment. "Adaptation," she said at last. "Very fast, very complete adaptation, as if each difficulty simply becomes the new starting point." She paused. "Our analysts find it difficult to model. There is no clear ceiling to the adaptation rate." I smiled at her. "We find it difficult to model too," I said. "We just stopped trying to find the ceiling." She excused herself shortly after, and I watched her go. The color shifts in her membrane as she walked away registered, according to my converter, as something between thoughtfulness and unease. Good. 3 days later, the Drachkin Compact quietly doubled the number of vessels inside the perimeter. The Council noted it, filed it, added it to the existing review process. I noted it too, filed it somewhere else entirely. Paul came to me that evening with the latest signals from the perimeter. The Drachkin ships were not doing anything overt, no weapons charged, no direct communications interfering with the colonies. They were simply present, occupying space, making it clear that the space was occupied. "They are sending a message," Paul said. "Yes," I said. "What is the message?" I looked at the sensor readout on the screen in front of me. 37 Drachkin vessels, 400,000 humans on the other side of their perimeter, an 18-month council review ticking away on a clock that had only just started. "The message," I said, "is that they think we are new here and that being new means being slow." I turned off the display. "They have not thought carefully enough about what being new means to us." Paul waited for me to say more. I did not. I went back to my desk and opened the archive again, reading, patient still. Outside the window, the stars of Evum Prime's dead star system hung motionless in the dark, and somewhere in the shipping lanes several sectors away, 32 Earth vessels were moving quietly into position, following no special orders that anyone outside my authorization chain would ever see. The Council believed it was reviewing a grievance. It had no idea it was watching a species that had been doing this, surviving, positioning, preparing for the entire length of its existence. We had been doing this since before these aliens had names for the stars we were standing under. We were just getting started. There is a specific kind of quiet that humans make when we are paying very close attention to something. It is not the quiet of people who have nothing to say. It is not the quiet of people who are confused or afraid. It is something different, a gathered, focused stillness that tends to settle over a person or a group when they have decided that this moment is important and that everything else can wait. I had grown up watching my grandmother go quiet like that. She had been a surgeon for 40 years, and whenever something unexpected happened in her operating room, she would go completely, utterly still. Not frozen still. There is a difference. Frozen means you have stopped because you do not know what to do. Still means you have stopped because you are deciding exactly what to do, and the decision requires your full attention. I thought about her often during those weeks on Evum Prime. By the end of the third week, the Council had noticed that my delegation went quiet a great deal. I knew this because Dr. Ashavin came to find me a second time, and this time she brought a colleague, a HFY analyst named Coordinator Pell, who introduced himself as a specialist in emerging civilization integration, which was a polite way of saying he studied new council members and assessed how quickly they would stop being a disruption. They found me in the observation lounge on level 72, reading. Paul was across the room, also reading. Two of my analysts were at a side table going through archive documents. We were all quiet. Pell looked around the room as if he expected to find something different. He said, "I hope we are not interrupting." "Not at all," I said, and set my reading aside. "Please sit." They sat. Pell had brought a small recording device, which he set on the table between us and asked my permission to use. I said yes, because refusing would have been more interesting to him than agreeing. "Commander Dross," he began, "as part of our standard integration review, we conduct informal assessments with new member delegations to better understand their cultural approaches to council participation. I hope you will forgive the directness. It saves time." "I prefer directness," I said. He seemed pleased by that, which told me he had been warned that humans were unpredictable, and straightforwardness was not what he had been expecting. "Excellent. Then directly, your delegation has been notably quiet in open sessions. You have attended every meeting, you have submitted all required documents on schedule, and yet you have not taken the floor to speak in 3 weeks. Most new member delegations are eager to establish their voice early." "We are listening," I said simply. "Listening," he repeated. "There is a great deal to learn here. The Council has been operating for 900 years. It would be arrogant of us to assume we had things to say before we understood what we were saying them into." Pell made a note. "And yet," he said carefully, "you have filed a grievance regarding the Drachkin perimeter." "Yes. That is not typically the action of a delegation that describes itself as listening." I looked at him for a moment. He had a flat, even gaze, the Savari default expression that showed nothing. I matched it completely. Filing a grievance is a council procedure. It is not speaking. It is using the system correctly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are members of the council who are curious about the posture of your delegation. The word they have used, and I share this in the spirit of transparency, is unusual." "Unusual," I said. Calm, organized, and yet simultaneously, he looked for the word watchful. Some delegates find the combination a little difficult to read. I smiled at him, warmly, genuinely, without showing what was behind it. "We are a very calm people," I said, "when things are going as expected." He made another note. Dr. Venn, who had been mostly silent during this exchange, spoke then. "Commander," she said, "I want to ask something that is outside the formal scope of this meeting, if you will permit it." "Of course." "My research into human psychology, specifically your species' documented responses to external threat, has flagged a pattern that I find genuinely difficult to reconcile." She folded her hands on the table. "Most species, when faced with a significant threat, exhibit one of several measurable physiological responses: heightened activity, increased communication, visible preparation. What your historical record shows in a significant number of cases is something different. Your species sometimes becomes quieter under threat, more organized, more contained." She paused. "My models associate that behavioral profile with two possible states. One is a civilization that has genuinely assessed the threat and determined it is manageable. The other is a civilization preparing to do something large." She looked at me with something I could only describe as careful, professional concern. "Which is it in your current assessment?" she asked. I held her gaze for a moment. Outside the window, the station's docking ring was moving through its slow rotation, ships sliding in and out of berths like breath. "Both," I said. She did not write anything down, she just looked at me. I offered them tea, real tea, brought from Earth, because I had learned early in my career that offering something familiar in an unfamiliar setting was the most disarming thing you could do. Pell declined politely. Venn accepted and held the cup with the careful curiosity of someone handling an artifact. After they left, Paul came over and sat where they had been sitting. "They are going to report that conversation," he said. "I know. What do you want the council to do with it?" I thought about that. "Think," I said. "I want them to sit with it and think about what it means. I want them to ask each other what a human delegation that describes itself as calm and watchful is actually doing. I want them to run their models and come up with theories, and I want every theory to be slightly uncomfortable." Paul nodded slowly. "And meanwhile?" "Meanwhile," I said, "we keep reading, we keep filing documents correctly, and we stay very, very still." The Drachkin delegate, Vora, made his move 4 days later. He did not do it in session. He came to our floor, which required a formal access request that I had approved, because refusing it would have meant something I was not ready to mean yet. And he appeared at the door of our main delegation room with 2 aides and an expression that suggested he had practiced what he was about to say. I met him in the entrance. I did not invite him further in. I stood in the doorway, which is a perfectly polite thing to do, and I waited. "Commander Dross," he said, "I wanted to offer a direct conversation, delegate to delegate." "I appreciate that," I said. "The perimeter situation," he said. "I want to be transparent with you. The Drachkin Compact has legitimate security concerns in that region. We have documented evidence of unregistered vessel activity and have an obligation to our own member worlds to respond to it. The perimeter is precautionary." I nodded. He continued, "I understand the grievance has been filed. That is your right, of course. The council process will resolve the question in due time. What I want to convey directly is that the compact has no interest in disrupting human colony life. The people on those worlds are not our concern. The space is." He was watching me very carefully as he said this, looking for something, probably the flicker of relief that a newer, smaller delegation might show when a larger power reassured them that things were not as serious as they appeared. I looked at him for a long moment. He was big, solid, clearly a person who had spent many years being the most formidable presence in most rooms. He had a politician's smoothness and a military officer's posture. He was used to conversations going the way he steered them. "I appreciate your transparency, Delegate Vora," I said. My voice was even. My hands were at my sides. "I will note that the council review is ongoing and that we expect the process to function as designed. If there is nothing further, I have work to return to." He blinked. That was all just a single blink, a tiny fracture in the smooth surface he had walked in with. He had expected more. A question, a counter, an invitation to negotiate, a sign of anxiety, anything. What he got was a polite, complete, utterly unreadable wall. "Of course," he said, "my door is always open." "As is mine," I said, and wished him a good afternoon. I watched him walk back to the lift. One of his aides said something to him quietly. He did not respond. That evening I sat at my desk and looked at the signal report from Earth Fleet Command. 32 vessels, still moving, still quiet, now approximately 6 days from their target position. I picked up the framed photograph I kept on my desk, my grandmother, standing outside the hospital where she had worked, squinting into the afternoon sun, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. She had once told me that the most important thing she had learned in 40 years of surgery was that the moment you start rushing was the moment you started making mistakes. That stillness was not inaction. That waiting, done correctly, was its own kind of force. I set the photograph down and went back to work. In the council chamber the next morning, I watched Vora take his seat. He glanced at me once. I was already looking at my documents. Somewhere in a sector that no council censor was watching carefully enough, 32 human ships moved through the dark like quiet, patient ghosts. And in chamber 1 of Evum Prime, a human woman sat still and waited, and every alien in the room who had bothered to pay attention was starting to understand slowly, without quite being able to name it, that the stillness was not empty. It was full. The colony ship Aurora's Path was not a military vessel. It carried families. It was in the business of bringing supplies to the farming settlement on Arctis 4, seed stock, medical equipment, a new atmospheric processor, and among its 314 passengers, about 80 children under the age of 12. It had cleared the Drachkin perimeter marker on what its captain, a man named Owen Hale, believed to be a properly filed transit route, approved 6 weeks before the perimeter was even established. The Drachkin intercepted it at 3:14 station time. They did not fire on it immediately. That is the important part of what happened next, and I want to be precise about it because precision matters here. They stopped it. They boarded it. They held its passengers and crew in the cargo bay for 9 hours while Drachkin officers went through every document, every manifest, every personal communication stored on the ship's network. They confiscated the atmospheric processor, reclassified it as regulated technology under a Drachkin code that had not existed 2 months earlier, and informed Captain Hale that his vessel was impounded pending a review that would take, at minimum, 90 days. They held 314 people, including 80 children, in a cargo bay for 9 hours, and then they left them sitting in a dead vessel in a contested perimeter zone with no power to their atmospheric systems beyond emergency backup. The distress signal reached Evum Prime at 7:01 hours. I received it at 7:03 when Paul knocked on my door, came in without waiting for an answer, and set a single sheet of data on my desk. His face was completely under control. His hands were not. I read the report. I read it again. Then I set it down very carefully, and I sat for exactly 30 seconds doing nothing except breathing. This is the thing about humans that I think the council never fully understood before that morning. We have a great deal of patience. We can hold it for a long time, but patience is not the same as limitlessness. Patience has a shape, and that shape has an edge, and when you find the edge, what is on the other side of it is not anger, not exactly. It is something more like absolute clarity. I picked up the data sheet and walked out of my room. I went to the council emergency session request terminal, a seldom used panel built into the wall of the main corridor on every delegation floor, because the council founders had understood that occasionally something could not wait 18 months. And I placed my hand on the panel and formally requested an emergency session on grounds of imminent harm to council member civilians. The session was convened in 40 minutes. That is extremely fast for the council. Someone had looked at the distress signal and understood that this particular situation was not something that could be quietly filed. The chamber filled quickly. I was already at the speaking floor when the last delegates took their seats, which was itself unusual. Most speakers waited to be recognized before stepping down. I had stepped down, and I was standing there, and the weight of my being there early communicated something to the room that I did not need to say with words. Coordinator Orvith called the session to order and recognized me immediately. I did not raise my voice. I want to be very clear about that because the instinct when describing what happened next is to imagine something loud, something that filled the chamber with sound. It was not like that. I spoke at the same volume I always used. I simply stopped using the diplomatic padding, though we understand the council's process, and we respect the ongoing review that I had been carefully layering over everything I said for 3 weeks. I presented the facts. Vessel Aurora's path, 314 civilians, 80 children, 9 hours in a cargo bay, impounded without legal standing under a newly created code that had not been part of any registered Drachkin law at the time the transit route was filed. Passengers currently sitting in emergency atmospheric backup with an estimated reserve of 31 hours. Then I put a single document on the council's shared display. It was the transit authorization that Captain Hale had filed 6 weeks before the perimeter existed. It was perfectly legal. It had been approved through council-registered channels. There was not a single procedural error in it. The Drachkin Compact has detained 314 civilians aboard a legally authorized vessel on a council-registered transit route, I said. They are currently in an unsafe atmospheric condition. I am requesting immediate council authorization for emergency relief access, and I am requesting a formal finding that this detention is a violation of Council Charter Article 14, which prohibits interference with registered civilian transit between member world installations. I stepped back from the speaking floor. Vora was on his feet before I had fully returned to the human delegation platform. He was smooth. I will give him that. He did not look alarmed. He looked concerned and reasonable, which is a much harder expression to hold when you know you are wrong. He spoke about the complexity of the security situation. He spoke about the Drachkin Compact's right to enforce safety standards within its perimeter. He acknowledged that the passengers' well-being was a priority and suggested that the Compact would arrange for atmospheric support to be provided within the next 12 hours. 12 hours on a 31-hour reserve for 80 children. Several delegates began to speak. The chamber fell into the kind of layered, procedural noise that I had spent 3 weeks learning to navigate. Arguments about jurisdiction, arguments about the legal standing of the perimeter, arguments about whether the grievance I had filed 3 weeks ago needed to be resolved before the emergency request could be acted on. I sat at my platform and waited. I let it go on for exactly 22 minutes. Then I stood, and when I stood, I did something that no one in that chamber had ever seen a human do in a formal council session. I did not request the floor. I simply began speaking, clearly and without rushing, into the chamber microphone. The room went quiet almost immediately. Not because the protocol required it, I had not been recognized, but because something in my voice made people listen. The council was founded on one principle above all others, I said. Not deliberation, not procedure, not the careful management of disputes between civilizations that have the luxury of time. The principle above all others was that the species that sit in this room protect the people under their care. That is the founding commitment. I looked around the chamber slowly. 314 people are sitting in a cargo bay right now. 80 of them are children. They have 31 hours of breathable air. I will not sit here for another 22 minutes of procedural argument. I looked directly at Orvith. Call the vote, I said. Emergency relief access, now. There was a silence in the chamber that was unlike any silence I had heard in that room before. It was not the silence of offense or surprise. It was the silence of 47 species, simultaneously recalibrating what they thought they understood about the delegation on Platform 48. Orvith called the vote. It passed in 11 minutes. As the session broke into the organized movement of implementation, emergency access authorized, Drachkin notified, a council relief vessel dispatched, I sent a second transmission to Fleet Command. 3 words. Contingency 7 active. The 32 vessels that had been sitting patiently in their quietly chosen position received the transmission and began moving. Not fast. They did not need to move fast. They were already close enough. They simply changed course and headed, calmly and directly, toward the Drachkin perimeter. They did not cloak. They broadcast standard Earth fleet identifiers on open channels. They filed no aggressive intent notices because they had no aggressive intent. They were simply moving. 32 Earth vessels, moving in formation, heading toward the location where 314 civilians were being held without breathable air. The Drachkin perimeter fleet saw them coming in approximately 4 hours. I was in my office, reviewing documents, when Paul received the signal that the Drachkin vessels in the perimeter had broken their holding formation. He came to my door and told me. "Which direction?" I asked. "Away from the Aurora's path," he said. I nodded and went back to my documents. 40 minutes later, Captain Owen Hale transmitted a relief of status message to Evam Prime. His vessel had full atmospheric power. His passengers were safe. The Drachkin boarding officers had departed his ship so quickly that they had left a data pad behind on the cargo bay floor. I read the transmission twice. Then I set it down, and I allowed myself for exactly 10 seconds to close my eyes. My grandmother had told me once that the moment after a hard surgery was always the strangest, not relief exactly, but a sudden awareness of everything you had been holding without noticing. The weight of it all at once when you could finally set it down. 10 seconds, then I opened my eyes and went back to work. Vora requested an urgent private meeting with me that evening. I agreed to see him because refusing would have been unkind, and I had no interest in being unkind. I met him in a neutral room on level 40, and I sat across the table from him, and I folded my hands, and I waited for him to speak. He said many things. He said that the situation had been a misunderstanding. He said that the Compact's forces had acted with incomplete information. He said that the atmosphere of the region was tense, and that decisions had been made in a context that he had not fully understood. He said this at length, carefully, in the tone of a man who was explaining something, and also watching very closely to see whether the explanation was working. When he finished, I said, "The passengers are safe. That is what matters most." He looked at me for a moment. "And the fleet," he said, "the 32 vessels." "On a scheduled repositioning," I said. He did not believe me. He knew I knew he did not believe me. We both sat with that knowledge for a moment. "I want to understand," he said slowly, "what kind of species you are." I looked at him across the table. Outside the room's window, the inner ring of Evam Prime was completing another rotation, steady and unbroken, the way it had been for 900 years. "We are the kind," I said, "that files the correct paperwork and then makes sure the paperwork is not the only thing we have filed." He was quiet. "Have a good evening, Delegate Vora," I said, and I stood and I left and I did not look back. In the corridor outside, Paul fell into step beside me. "The council is meeting informally tonight," he said. "Without us. Several delegations have requested a closed session to discuss the human response." "I know," I said. "Are you worried about it?" I thought about the chamber this morning, the vote, the silence before it, the way the room had gone still when I had simply started speaking, and the way that stillness had felt different from every other silence in that room, charged, tilted, like something had shifted in the air. "No," I said, "let them meet, let them talk about us, let them try to put words to what they saw today." We walked the rest of the way to our floor without speaking. The station hummed softly around us, ancient and enormous, full of civilizations that had been here for centuries. And somewhere in the conversation happening without us, 47 species were sitting in rooms, and trying to find language for something they had never encountered before in 900 years of this council's existence. A species that followed every rule, filed every form, waited with impossible patience. And then, without raising its voice, without a single moment of panic, simply moved 32 warships into position while everyone else was still talking. They were trying to find the word for what we were. I could have told them the word, but it was more useful to let them keep looking. The informal session lasted 11 hours. I know this because Paul had managed, through a combination of careful relationship building and the natural human talent for making friends with people who think they are just being politely professional, to establish a working rapport with two aides from smaller delegations who kept him loosely informed of things we were not supposed to know. Not through any improper channel, nothing that violated council rules, but through the kind of conversations that happen when two people share a meal in the station's lower-level canteen and talk about their jobs the way people everywhere talk about their jobs, which is honestly and without complete filter. The session, from what Paul gathered, had covered three main areas. First, whether the human delegation had violated the council charter by activating a fleet asset during an active council mediation process. Second, whether the Aurora's path situation represented a deliberate provocation by the Drachkin Compact or a genuine miscommunication. Third, and this was the part that Paul told me with the particular careful expression he used when he was not entirely sure how I would receive something, whether Humanities Council membership should remain provisional or whether it needed to be placed under a more formal review structure. I heard all of this and then made tea. Paul watched me make tea and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are not concerned about the third point?" "Not particularly," I said. "They are discussing our membership status." "They are discussing whether to feel comfortable with us," I said. "That is a different thing, and the answer to that question was always going to take longer than 3 weeks to resolve." I handed him a cup. "What I want to know is whether any of the 47 delegations said anything that sounded like genuine alarm rather than political discomfort." He thought about it. "One," he said. "The Fen delegate apparently told the group that in reviewing our historical record, he had noted that every major expansion of human territory in our own system had been preceded by exactly this kind of incident, a provocation, a restrained response, and then a rapid shift in the balance of the region. He compared it to something in their own ancient history, a slow tide that does not look like it is moving until everything is already wet." I sipped my tea. "The Fen delegate is very perceptive," I said. "He called for the council to formally ask Earth to withdraw the 32 vessels as a condition of continued provisional membership." "And what did the rest of the session say to that?" Paul was quiet for a moment. 14 delegations voted in favor of the request, 22 voted against it, 11 abstained. I set down my cup. 14 in favor of limiting us, 22 against, 11 undecided. The mathematics of it settled around me like a room coming into focus after a long time in the dark. 14 was not nothing. But 22 meant something significant. And what it meant was that more than half of the council's membership had looked at what I had done, filed the grievance, activated the fleet, spoken without permission in open session, delivered 314 people from a cargo bay, and decided that this was acceptable behavior from a member civilization. Not because they thought we were safe, I had no illusions about that. Because they thought we were useful. The formal session the next morning was supposed to be about the Fenes-Sivari trade dispute, which had been on the agenda for 2 weeks. It was not about that. Within the first 4 minutes, Coordinator Orvith acknowledged the events of the previous 48 hours and opened the floor for any delegation that wished to formally address the matter. 7 delegations spoke before me. Some of them expressed concern about precedent. Some of them expressed appreciation for the speed of the resolution. Vora's aide, Vora himself, had not come to session, which told me something, delivered a statement affirming the Dratchkin Compact's continued commitment to Council cooperation and expressing regret for the misunderstanding regarding the Aurora's path. Regret for the misunderstanding, not regret for the action. I noted the precise language and filed it. When I took the speaking floor, I felt the chamber settle in a way that had become, over the past several days, recognizable. The gathered, paying attention quiet, the weight of it. I spoke for exactly 9 minutes. I want to be precise about this because precision is the thing I want to leave with. I began by acknowledging the concern that several delegations had raised about the activation of Earth fleet assets during an ongoing Council process. I told them directly that if the Council found, upon review, that I had acted outside the scope of my authority, I would accept that finding without argument and request guidance on the appropriate limits. I meant this. I was not performing humility. I was genuinely open to being wrong about the line. Then I told them what I was not open to being wrong about. There were 80 children in a cargo bay with 31 hours of breathable air, I said. The Council process, correctly followed, would have taken 18 months to formally resolve the situation that put them there. I did not have 18 months. I had 31 hours, so I used what I had. I looked around the chamber. I want to be clear about what humanity is, I said. Not as a threat, not as a warning, just as information because you are going to be working with us for a long time and clarity is more useful than mystery. I paused. We are a species that has never had anyone else to rely on. For the entire length of our existence, when things went wrong, we fixed them ourselves. When things threatened us, we faced them ourselves. When we nearly ended, we rebuilt ourselves. We did not do this because we are strong or exceptional. We did it because there was no other option. That is simply what we are. Another pause. We are very glad to be in this room. We intend to follow the rules of this body because we believe in the principle behind them. But we want you to understand something. Following rules and being passive are not the same thing. We will do one. We will never do the other. I stepped back. The chamber was very quiet. Then, from the back of the Ark, from Platform 31, where the Fen delegation sat, came a sound that took me a moment to identify. It was the Fen equivalent of a slow exhale. A deliberate, considered sound that their cultural liaison had once told Paul was used when something settled into place that had been uncertain before. It was, roughly translated, the sound of understanding. Other delegations were less settled. I could see it in the way they sat, not alarmed, exactly, but recalibrated. The word Dr. Venn had used weeks ago surfaced in my mind. Unusual. They had called us unusual because they did not yet have the right word. Orvith called for the Fen-Savari trade discussion to resume. The session continued. The day went on. But something had changed in the chamber that morning, and everyone who had been there knew it, and the knowing of it was its own kind of statement. 3 days later, the formal review of my fleet authorization came back from the Council's procedural committee. Their finding: the action fell within the emergency relief provision of Article 14, the same article I had cited when requesting the vote. The fleet had moved in response to an imminent civilian safety crisis, not as an act of territorial aggression. The committee recommended a clarification of language in the article to better define the parameters of member state military support during active Council mediation. A clarification that, when I read the draft text, was clearly written with human behavior specifically in mind. I endorsed the clarification without hesitation. I even offered 2 additional suggestions for the language, which the committee accepted. Paul read the final text and said, very quietly, "They wrote the rules with us in mind." "Yes," I said. "Is that a good thing or a problem?" I thought about it for a moment. "Both," I said, "and that is exactly where I want us to be." The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatically, there was no ceremony, no formal shift in tone. But the texture of the space around the human delegation changed in a way that I noticed and chose not to remark upon. Delegations that had not spoken to us before began to. Small things. A nod in the corridor, an invitation to a shared meal in the station's mid-level dining area, a message from the Murath Collective's office asking whether Commander Dross would be interested in a briefing on a long-standing resource dispute that they had been unable to move through the council process for 7 years. 7 years. I read that message twice and then replied within the hour. The Murath dispute involved a mineral extraction operation in a contested zone between their territory and a non-member civilization called the Garath. The Garath were not in the council. They were exactly the kind of smaller species that the council's procedural weight made it very easy to overlook, because they did not have the resources to participate in the process, and so the process had, over 7 years, simply ground past them. The Murath had the legal standing to push the case, but had not been able to generate sufficient council interest to move it to a vote. I read the full case file in 2 evenings. It was a clear injustice, documented in detail, sitting in a pile of other clear injustices that the council's 18-month standard review process had simply converted into background noise. I brought it to the floor in formal session the following week. I presented it not as a human interest. It was not. We had no territory near the Garath, but as a principle. I argued that the council's review timelines, whatever their administrative logic, could not be allowed to become a mechanism by which smaller civilizations were simply outweighed into irrelevance. I proposed a standing expedited review track for cases where one party lacked council membership, and therefore lacked the institutional standing to navigate the standard process. It took 4 sessions of debate. It passed. The Garath received notification of the expedited review within the month. Their representative, a young diplomat named Sel, who had never been to Evum Prime before, came to thank me in person. She was small, light-boned, with large eyes that moved very quickly across everything in a room, the way the eyes of someone do when they are still learning whether the environment around them is safe. She found me in our delegation chamber, and she stood in the doorway and she said, "I did not expect anyone to help us." I said, "That is not something you should have to say." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you?" I thought about the honest answer to that question. The honest answer was layered. It was about principle, yes, but it was also about something more practical. Humanity had been the small civilization once. We had been the species that was too chaotic, too unpredictable, too new. We knew what it felt like to be in a room where the established parties had learned to navigate around you rather than address you directly. But the other part of the honest answer was this: we helped because we could. We were in a position where our voice in that chamber had weight, and we had weight because of what had happened with the Aurora's path. And what had happened with the Aurora's path had happened because I had positioned 32 ships 6 days before anyone needed them. That is the thing about preparation. It is invisible right up until it is not. We helped, I told Sel, because it was the right thing to do and we had the ability to do it. She thanked me again and left. Paul watched her go and then looked at me. "You just made an ally," he said. "We made an ally," I said. "This is not a one-person operation." He smiled, which was one of the relatively rare occasions I had seen him do it without prompting. "You know what I find interesting," he said. 3 months ago, the council thought we were here to observe and learn. Now smaller species are coming to us. I looked out the window at the inner ring. The same ring I had been looking at for 3 months, rotating, constant, the ships moving in and out in their quiet and endless procession. "They thought we were new," I said. "New means uncertain. New means finding your footing. New means you have not quite figured out the room yet." I turned from the window. "We have been figuring out rooms our entire existence," I said. "Every room we have ever entered, we did not walk in knowing the layout. We walked in, we learned the layout faster than anyone expected, and then we started rearranging the furniture." Paul thought about that. Is that what we are doing here, rearranging the furniture? I picked up the next file from the stack on my desk. The Murath had sent over 3 additional cases they thought might qualify for the new expedited track. There were also 2 messages from delegations I had not spoken with yet, both requesting informal meetings. And beneath those, a long briefing from Earth Fleet Command on the current positioning of vessels across the 14 systems bordering Drachkin space. Not aggressive, not alarming, just there, the way a well-placed tool is there when you need it. Not yet, I said. Right now we are just making sure we can reach everything when we need to. I sat down and got back to work. Somewhere outside the window, in the vast and ancient dark that surrounded Evum Prime, a galaxy that had been doing things a certain way for 900 years was adjusting, slowly and without quite realizing it, to the presence of something it had not accounted for. Not a threat, not an enemy, not even precisely a disruption. Just a species that had looked at the room and understood it, completely and without illusion, and had decided, quietly, patiently, with perfect paperwork and 32 ships in the right place, exactly what kind of seat it intended to occupy. We had spent 10,000 years looking at the stars and wondering who was out there. Now we knew. And out there, for the first time, they were wondering about us. That seemed, all things considered, exactly right.